War of the Worlds, The Resurrection. A novel by J. M. Dillard. Chapter 9. Harrison's mouth was dry, but it had nothing to do with the heat of the desert. He drove the bronco, Ironhorse next to him in the front seat, Suzanne in the back. The second Harrison had seen the barricade, he knew with an inexplicable growing excitement that something had happened, and the grim set of Ironhorse's jaw told him that whatever it wasn't good. He listened quietly as Ironhorse spoke and tried not to look as though he were gloating about his little victory over the colonel, thanks to Norton's tape. Which he was, of course. He'd hated the colonel the moment he'd laid eyes on him. Clayton Forrester's experience had taught his adopted son to hate everyone involved with the military government bureaucracy. Harrison hated them for their blind, unquestioning obedience, for their narrow preoccupation with details, for their disregard for the truth. It was the military who overrode all of Forrester's suggestions for dealing with the alien remains, who made it impossible for Forrester's warnings to be heard. It was the military, Harrison had long ago decided, that drove his adoptive father to the verge of a complete mental breakdown. But, much as Harrison distrusted Ironhorse, it was clear that for the moment at least they needed each other, and it was clear that Ironhorse wanted the tape of the transmissions badly enough to start talking. "The installation in question is the Jericho Valley disposal site," Ironhorse said, glancing over his shoulder at Suzanne to include her in the conversation. Harrison tilted his head to one side to hear better. Jericho Valley. The name sounded vaguely familiar. Harrison tried to place it, but failed. Suzanne's eyes widened slightly. "Disposal of what, exactly?" "Nuclear and toxic wastes," Ironhorse replied matter-of-factly. "Don't worry, we won't be exposing you to anything. At least, nothing significant." "For some reason, I don't like the sound of that," Harrison said half under his breath. The colonel paused to stare at Harrison from under his mirrored sunglasses, then continued in a detached tone. "Approximately 36 hours ago, Jericho Valley was attacked. Communications were cut off. When we checked it out, we found the gates wide open and all 17 soldiers stationed there dead, killed." Harrison caught Suzanne's horrified expression in the rearview mirror. Maybe she realizes I'm not nuts after all. He asked Ironhorse, "How?" Ironhorse stared out the window. "Most died when the barracks were blown sky high. I figured they used a rocket launcher. Poor bastards must have been asleep. 3 were shot. Automatic weapons." Harrison wasn't exactly sure what he'd been expecting to hear, but that wasn't it. Suzanne paled. "Terrorists?" Ironhorse did not answer at first. He gestured for Harrison to turn. "Here it is." The bronco kicked up dust as it veered left onto a narrow gravel driveway. "Guess you could call them that, Dr. McCullough," Ironhorse said, answering her question. He shrugged. "But it's just a convenient label. It doesn't tell us who or why. Don't worry, ma'am. They're gone. Left fast. No threats, no demands, no calling cards. Just killed everyone and split, and left the bodies to rot where the birds could get at 'em." Suzanne shuddered. "And if they sent any transmissions," the colonel looked over at Harrison, "they took their equipment with them." "If they really were terrorists," Harrison asked, "then why didn't they take advantage of the fact that this was a nuclear waste dump?" Ironhorse nodded. "Exactly, but they didn't. We found 1 barrel shot up, oozing radioactive waste. Still, it seems strange that they wouldn't have prepared for that contingency, that something like that would have been enough to scare them off after they went to the trouble of killing 17 men." Maybe something else scared them off, Harrison almost said, but decided against it. His mind raced over the possibilities. Maybe it wasn't a return of the unfriendly invaders after all. Could it have been the appearance of a UFO that frightened them off? There were radiation suits in the guard shack in case of accidents, the colonel continued. They could have protected themselves. The Bronco pulled up in front of a military base surrounded by a high chain-link fence. As Ironhorse had mentioned, the gates were swung open. Inside, men wearing radiation suits and square white hoods of heavy lead-lined material wandered around taping with handheld cameras. Ironhorse directed Harrison to park the Bronco outside the gate, next to a personnel carrier, and climbed out. Before Suzanne could struggle out in her impractically narrow skirt, Ironhorse was already on the passenger side, offering a helpful arm. She took it reluctantly. "So now," the colonel said to Harrison, who climbed out of the driver's side, "you can see why I'd like to have that tape analyzed. Could I ask how it is you happen to acquire it, or don't I need to know?" Harrison smiled. He still couldn't stand the man, but at least Ironhorse had the good grace to poke fun at his own terminology. "It's not classified. We broadcast radio signals into space and also monitor for transmissions." "Who were these people trying to contact?" Ironhorse seemed more confused than enlightened by Harrison's explanation. "I don't know." Harrison feigned ignorance. "Suffice it to say, we managed to pick them up because they were using some serious equipment." If he gave Ironhorse the same explanation he gave Suzanne, that would be the end of the guided tour right there. She gave him a knowing look he interpreted as meaning that she understood. "I get the uncomfortable feeling you're hiding something from me." Ironhorse frowned, but motioned them toward a large army green van parked just beyond the personnel carrier. "If it was just the radiation," he said, "I could probably fit you into protective gear and send you in for a look. But whoever overran this installation did a pretty professional job of mining the area. You'll have to be satisfied with our remotes." He slid open the side panel of the van. "I'm surprised he didn't send us out there then," Harrison muttered in Suzanne's ear. She didn't react, but Ironhorse, who caught it, smiled sourly and thrust out his hand as Harrison moved to step up into the van. "The tape first, Dr. Blackwood." Harrison returned the wry smile, fished the tape from his pocket, and dropped it into Ironhorse's waiting palm. The colonel moved aside and let him pass. Inside, a bank of video monitors lined the opposite wall of the van. Two technicians, sitting with their backs to Harrison and the others, manned the control panels. Upon realizing that Ironhorse had entered, they struggled to rise. "At ease," Ironhorse said abruptly. The two techs sank back down. The colonel removed his sunglasses and slipped them into his shirt pocket. His eyes were dark, almost black, and so coldly intimidating that Harrison decided he liked him better with the sunglasses on. Harrison found it easiest to focus on one of the monitors at a time. The images were unprofessional, fuzzy, made by the handheld cameras they'd seen wandering inside the installation. This particular soldier was aiming his camera at the bombed-out barracks. Harrison saw a jagged, blackened ceiling beam lying across a mangled government-issue cot, its mattress torn and blood-spattered. He looked away quickly at a different monitor. Better. The camera was panning over a boring stretch of dirt that looked as if a gang of motorcyclists had roared through it, maybe popping a few wheelies. Another soldier wearing the white radiation gear wandered through the shop briefly. A third monitor showing a puzzling scene. Steel drums stacked only on the top tier of a wooden flat. "Strange," Harrison whispered to himself. The camera pulled back. In the background, some barrels, older, rusting, lay on their sides. Something about the sight didn't seem right, compelled him to take a step closer for a better look. But then the camera moved on abruptly to a view of what appeared to be a stack of bodies, draped discreetly with black garbage bag plastic. "Back up!" Harrison shouted at the monitor. The guy couldn't hear him, of course, but he was standing close enough to one of the techs to grab his mic and find the off-on switch. "Hey!" the technician exclaimed, but Harrison scarcely heard him. "Back up, soldier!" he barked into the mic, "and focus on those overturned barrels." Ironhorse was at his side instantly and grabbed his wrist, then slowly peeled the mic from his fingers. "That's it, Doctor. You've seen enough." Harrison ignored him. His gaze was fastened on the monitor as the camera obeyed and slowly panned back to the new barrels, and then the older rusty ones. "Tell him to zoom in," Harrison ordered the tech. "Tell him." Ironhorse nodded at the tech, who leaned over his reappropriated mic. "Camera 3, zoom in." "What is it?" Suzanne's voice in his ear. But he couldn't answer just yet. An alarm had sounded somewhere deep in his memory, triggered somehow by the sight of the overturned barrels. He struggled to piece it together. The camera zoomed in on the new barrels. "Not those!" Harrison shouted. "Lower! On the ground!" The technician said something unintelligible into the mic. The image tilted, the focus adjusted, and settled on the overturned barrel. "Classified, 1951 to 1953, it said along its side. And U.S. government property, hazardous, do not remove. Classified, 1951 to 1953. Harrison shivered and broke into a sweat. He had seen those markings before. 21 years ago, when Clayton had first brought out the files, Harrison closed his eyes and saw the photograph in Clayton's trembling hand. "Here." Clayton handed him the picture. "Those are the barrels the government stuffed the remains into. They all bear the same distinctive markings. Classified, 1951 to 1953. Hundreds of thousands of them," Clayton had said, his voice flat and bitter. "Hidden away in military installations and other secret locations all over the country. Some of them only a few hundred miles from here, in Jericho Valley." Jericho Valley. No wonder it had sounded familiar. Harrison opened his eyes and stared at the monitor. The cameraman waxed creative and pulled back, then zoomed in again, this time using a different angle. The top of the barrel had been forced open from the inside. Dear God, the drum was empty. Harrison's knees went weak. He clutched at the console to keep from falling, only vaguely aware of Suzanne's and the Colonel's eyes on him. "Ask him." He tried to speak louder, but his voice remained a hoarse whisper. "Ask him if there are any more barrels like that." "Camera 3?" the tech asked. "What's the count on barrels in this condition?" The voice filtered through the console. "We found 6 empties." Harrison reached for the mic switch again, shouting as he suddenly found his voice. 6 empties? But how many old barrels with these markings? There should be hundreds, thousands." "Only 6 old barrels with the 1953 stamp on them," the voice said. Ironhorse firmly pulled Harrison's hand off the switch and replaced it with his own. "Soldier," he leaned in over the console, "how long until you've done an inventory check?" "We're hours away, Colonel. This place has been a nuclear waste dump for nearly 40 years. "Oh, God," Harrison whispered, his gaze fixed on the monitor. "No." He closed his eyes and saw it all happening again. The sky streaked with death rays and glowing dull orange-red from the fires that raged out of control, the air thick with smoke and screams of the fleeing. Those bodies not reduced to cinders by the rays lay crushed under debris, or exposed where they were trampled to death by the terrified crowds. He was not quite 5 years old, and had just seen his parents killed by the aliens' rays. The memory of it clutched at him full force, pulling him down into a dark vortex of panic. "Harrison, darling, get up!" He'd run screaming through the streets until his voice and legs gave out and he collapsed, sobbing on the sidewalk. And now the nightmare was starting again. Harrison turned and ran out of the van. "What's wrong with him?" Ironhorse asked. The gruffness was gone from his voice, and in its place was genuine puzzlement. Suzanne was still gaping in the direction Harrison had fled. "I don't know," she answered slowly. Whatever he had seen had driven him berserk. She was shaken. She had judged him to be eccentric, perhaps slightly obsessed by the need to find the aliens who had killed his parents. Now she saw it was far worse than that. The man was in trouble. The man needed psychiatric help. Suzanne turned back to stare with Ironhorse at the close-up of the open barrel. It was clear to her that the base had been attacked by terrorists who had stolen the nuclear waste for God knew what evil purpose, and that frightened her, as much as Harrison's panic attack. Obviously, he had been counting on finding his aliens here, and now could not accept the fact that his misguided search had failed. "Excuse me," she said to Ironhorse, and went outside to look for Harrison. She didn't have to look far. He was in the Bronco, slumped down in the passenger seat. She walked over and bent down to peer into the open window. He was hugging himself tightly. Sweat trickled from his forehead, but she knew it had nothing to do with the heat. His lips were parted slightly as he stared straight ahead into the darkness. "Harrison, are you okay?" He wasn't. He jerked sharply at the sound of her voice and looked up at her. His pale blue eyes were bright, wild. "We have to leave." She stared at him, unable to think of an answer. "Now, damn it!" She withdrew from the window. Ironhorse stood at the van's entrance, watching. She could have gone back to him then and told him Blackwood was having a mental breakdown, and she was afraid to get into the truck with him. Maybe the army would get her home. Instead, she walked around to the driver's side, climbed in, and turned the ignition key. They rode the entire 7 hours in silence.